Nathan Coleridge crawled through darkness beneath 12 feet of snow, dragging supplies through a tunnel that shouldn't exist. Above ground, 2 trappers lay dead in their cabins, starved with full supply caches visible through their windows but unreachable in the blizzard that buried the Montana wilderness in 1842. Before we go further, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival move you, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. Nathan Coleridge crawled through darkness on his hands and knees, the canvas sack of dried venison dragging behind him through the narrow tunnel. His breath came in controlled measures, each exhalation creating small clouds of vapor that dissipated against the timber-shored walls, pressing close on either side. Above him, he knew, lay 12 feet of compacted snow. Around him, the Montana winter of 1842 raged with a fury that had already killed 2 men in cabins less than 5 miles away. But Nathan was warm, fed, and moving freely between his cabin and his supplies through a passage that existed entirely beneath the frozen chaos of the surface world. The tunnel was 2 feet wide, just enough for a grown man to navigate on hands and knees. The ceiling, supported by rough-cut timber ribs spaced every 3 feet, pressed low enough that Nathan's back brushed against it as he moved. The passage extended 22 feet from the rear wall of his cabin to the underground cache chamber he had excavated into the hillside behind his shelter. The journey took less than 2 minutes, but those 2 minutes represented the difference between survival and death in conditions that had transformed the Rocky Mountain wilderness into a white tomb for men who had built their cabins the conventional way. Nathan emerged from the tunnel into his cache chamber, a space roughly 8 feet square carved into the earth and reinforced with log crib walls. The temperature here was stable, hovering around 45 degrees, regardless of the conditions above. Wooden shelves lined 3 walls, stocked with supplies that would carry him through the remainder of winter: dried meat, flour in sealed tins, coffee, salt, ammunition, medical supplies, and firewood cut to lengths that would fit through the tunnel. Everything organized, everything accessible, everything protected from the elements that had rendered the surface world uninhabitable. He filled his sack methodically, selecting enough supplies for 3 days. Then he began the crawl back to his cabin, pulling the heavy sack behind him through the confined passage. 20 minutes later, Nathan sat in his cabin, the fire burning steady in the stone fireplace he had built into the corner. He unpacked the supplies and arranged them on his shelves. Through the small window he could see nothing but white, snow pressed against the glass, completely obscuring any view of the world beyond. His front door, he knew, was buried under a drift that reached nearly to the roofline. If he had relied on that door, on conventional access to the world outside, he would be trapped, slowly starving or slowly freezing as his indoor firewood supply dwindled, unable to reach the cache that sat just 40 feet from his cabin's front wall. But he had learned that lesson the previous winter. He had learned it in the worst possible way, and that lesson, written in snow and sealed with death, had driven him to build something that other trappers called madness, a backdoor that led down instead of out, a tunnel that defied common sense, an innovation born not from inspiration, but from helplessness. The fall of 1841 had arrived with all the promise that drew men to the Rocky Mountain wilderness. Nathan Coleridge and Robert Fletcher established their camp in a valley carved by centuries of water flow, surrounded by beaver ponds, and far enough from established trails to avoid competition from other trappers. Both men had survived multiple winters in the mountains. Nathan had trapped for 6 seasons, Robert for 4. They knew how to read weather, how to process pelts, how to avoid the mistakes that killed inexperienced men every year. They considered themselves competent, careful, and adequately prepared for whatever winter might bring to the high country. The cabin they built followed standard mountainman construction that had proven adequate for decades. They selected a site near the creek for water access, felled lodgepole pines for walls, notched the logs at corners, and chinked the gaps with moss and mud. The structure took 5 days to complete with both men working. A single door faced south to catch what winter sun might reach them. One small window provided light and ventilation. The roof was simple poles covered with bark and sod. Inside, they built a basic stone fireplace, sleeping platforms, and storage shelves. The cabin would keep out wind and rain. That was sufficient, or so they believed. Their supply strategy followed equally conventional wisdom. They built an outdoor cache 30 feet from the cabin's front door. The cache was a raised platform 8 feet off the ground to keep supplies away from animals and moisture. They constructed a small roof over the platform and walls of split logs around the sides. The elevation and separation from the cabin served two purposes. First, it kept food away from the cabin's heat, which would spoil dried meat and encourage mold in flour. Second, it protected supplies from bears or other animals that might break into a cabin but rarely figured out how to climb platform legs wrapped with sheet metal they had packed in from St. Louis. They stocked the cache methodically through October and early November. 500 pounds of dried venison and elk. 200 pounds of flour in sealed tins. Salt, coffee, sugar, ammunition, replacement traps, medical supplies including laudanum for pain and sulfur, powder for infections. Firewood was stacked separately near the cabin in covered cords that would last through March if they burned conservatively. Everything was organized, labeled, and accessible via a simple ladder from cache platform to ground. They could resupply from the cache in minutes, carrying back what they needed for a week or two at a time. By late November, they had completed their preparations. Trap lines were established along the creek and its tributaries. Initial catches were promising. The beaver population was healthy and apparently undisturbed by other trappers. Robert estimated they could take 300 pelts by spring, worth perhaps $2,000 when sold in St. Louis. The winter ahead looked profitable and manageable. They had food, shelter, supplies, and experience. The first snow fell on December 3rd, light and almost welcome. Winter had arrived on schedule. Everything seemed perfect. The storm arrived on December 9th, 1841, with a fury that Nathan had never witnessed in 6 winters of mountain trapping. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours. Wind howled down from the high peaks with enough force to shake the cabin walls. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Nathan and Robert secured themselves inside, adding extra wood to the fire and settling in to wait out what they assumed would be a typical early winter storm, lasting perhaps 2 or 3 days before clearing. The snow did not stop after 3 days. It continued for 6 days without pause. When the wind finally died on December 15th and visibility returned, Nathan opened the cabin door to find it blocked completely by a wall of white that extended from ground to header beam. He pushed against it experimentally. The snow was packed solid by wind pressure, compressed into a mass that might as well have been ice. He closed the door and moved to the window. What he saw made his stomach contract with the first. Real fear he had felt since entering the mountains. The world had disappeared. Snow had accumulated to depths that transformed familiar landmarks into alien landscapes. The creek was invisible, buried under drifts. The trees showed only their upper branches. The cache platform, built 8 feet off the ground, was barely visible. Nathan could see the roof of the cache structure protruding above the snow surface, but the platform itself, the ladder, the supplies they had so carefully organized, all of it lay beneath 10 to 12 feet of accumulated snow. He could see it from the window, 30 feet away. 5 seconds of walking in normal conditions, it might as well have been 30 miles. Robert joined him at the window and stared in silence for several minutes before speaking. They had enough food inside the cabin for perhaps 2 weeks if they rationed carefully. Firewood stacked inside would last a week, maybe 10 days, if they kept the fire minimal and accepted cold nights. The cache held everything they needed to survive until spring. Food, fuel, medicine, ammunition, everything, right there, visible, unreachable. The mathematics of their situation was brutally simple. They needed to access the cache or they would starve before winter ended. Robert proposed digging. They had 2 shovels stored inside the cabin for clearing paths and managing snow around the door. they could dig a trench from the cabin door to the cache platform, 30 feet, perhaps 3 feet wide. Through 10 feet of packed snow. Nathan calculated quickly. They would be moving roughly 900 cubic feet of snow. Each shovelful, perhaps half a cubic foot, 1,800 shovelfuls, in below-zero temperatures, with limited food energy to sustain the work, and more snow would fall. It always did. They might dig for days, only to have a single night of snowfall refill everything they had moved, but they had no alternative. The next morning, December 16th, Robert began digging out the front door, while Nathan rationed their remaining indoor supplies and tried not to think about the impossibility of what they were attempting. Robert Fletcher attacked the snow with determination that bordered on desperation. He started before dawn on December 16th, working by lantern light to excavate the wall of packed snow that sealed the cabin door. Nathan took turns with him, both men working in shifts to conserve energy and prevent complete exhaustion. The work was brutal. Each shovelful of snow weighed perhaps 10 pounds when compressed by wind. Lifting it, throwing it aside, cutting deeper into the drift that pressed against the cabin like a frozen siege wall. After 4 hours of continuous effort, they had cleared the door and created a trench roughly 6 feet long, extending into the drift. 24 feet remained between them and the cache platform. The temperature held steady at 15 degrees below zero. Not the coldest Nathan had experienced, but cold enough. That exposed skin froze in minutes. Robert wrapped cloth around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. He wore heavy gloves, but gloves thick enough to prevent frostbite were awkward for gripping the shovel handle. Thin gloves allowed better control but provided minimal protection. Robert compromised, using moderate gloves and accepting that his hands would grow numb after 30 minutes of work. He would warm them by the fire, then return to digging. The pattern repeated throughout the day. By nightfall, the trench extended 12 feet from the cabin, halfway to the cache. Robert's hands were white and stiff. Nathan examined them carefully by firelight. The fingertips showed the waxy appearance that indicated first-stage frostbite. Not severe yet, but dangerous if exposure continued. Nathan insisted Robert rest the next day while Nathan continued the digging alone. Robert refused. They needed the cache supplies. One man working would take twice as long. They could not afford twice as long. December 17th brought new snow. 4 inches fell during the night, partially filling the trench they had excavated. They shoveled out the new accumulation, then continued extending the trench toward the cache. Robert's hands were worse. The fingertips had progressed from white to gray. He could barely feel them. Nathan noticed Robert fumbling with the shovel, his grip weakening as nerve damage progressed. By evening, they had reached 18 feet. 12 feet remained. Robert sat by the fire, holding his hands near the flames, trying to restore circulation that was no longer fully responding. On December 18th, Nathan dug alone. Robert's hands had swollen during the night. The fingers were stiff, painful to bend. Dark patches had appeared on 3 fingertips where tissue was dying. Frostbite had progressed to second stage. The tissue damage was permanent. Nathan knew infection would follow. It always did with deep frostbite. The body's attempt to heal damaged. Tissue created inflammation. Inflammation in extremities with poor circulation led to bacterial infection. They had laudanum for pain and sulfur powder for infection in the cache. Right there. 24 feet away, through packed snow. Nathan dug until his own hands went numb. By nightfall, the trench extended 22 feet. 8 feet remained. Robert's hands had begun to smell. Robert Fletcher died on December 22, 1841, 4 days after the infection took hold in his damaged hands. The smell had progressed from subtle to unmistakable by December 20th. His fingers swelled to twice their normal size, the skin splitting in places where pressure exceeded capacity. Fever arrived on December 21st. Robert shivered violently despite lying next to the fire, wrapped in every blanket they possessed. He drifted between consciousness and delirium, sometimes lucid enough to apologize for his weakness, other times calling out names of family members Nathan had never heard him mention. Nathan sat beside him and watched helplessly. The cache held laudanum that could ease the pain. It held sulfur powder that might fight the infection if applied early enough. It held clean cloth for bandages and whiskey for sterilization. All of it sat in the wooden structure that Nathan could see through the cabin window. Now, only 6 feet beyond the end of the trench, he had managed to extend on December 19th before his own exhaustion made further digging impossible. 6 feet, perhaps 2 hours of work in normal conditions. An impossible distance given Robert's condition and Nathan's depleted strength. Robert's breathing became labored on the evening of December 21st. His fever spiked high enough that his skin burned to the touch. Nathan tried to cool him with snow, but the fever consumed him from within. Shortly after midnight on December 22nd, Robert's breathing stopped. Nathan sat with the body until dawn, unable to process what had happened, unable to accept that his partner had died 30 feet from medicine that could have saved him. The ground outside was frozen solid. Nathan could not dig a grave. He wrapped Robert's body in canvas and carried it outside into the trench they had excavated together. He covered it with snow and marked the spot with a cross fashioned from firewood. Spring arrived in late March. The snow melted slowly, revealing the world that had been buried for 4 months. Nathan dug Robert's grave on April 2nd in soil that had finally thawed enough to accept a shovel. He buried his partner on a hillside overlooking the valley where they had trapped together. He marked the grave with stones arranged carefully to resist erosion. He spoke no words. There were no words adequate to the situation. Nathan remained in the valley through trapping season, working the lines alone, processing pelts mechanically while his mind worked on a different problem entirely. He realized something during those long months between Robert's death and his departure for St. Louis in June. The cabin had not failed them. The cache had not failed them. The supplies had been adequate and properly stored. What had failed was the fundamental assumption underlying frontier shelter design, the assumption that doors provided reliable access to the world outside, the assumption that surface-level passage was sufficient for survival. Robert had died because conventional construction created a single point of access that could be rendered useless by conditions beyond human control. The cabin had become a tomb with a window. Nathan returned to the valley in late July of 1842 with supplies that confused the few trappers who saw him passing through the mountains. He carried the standard goods: powder, lead, coffee, salt. But he also carried tools that made no sense for a man planning to trap beaver: 2 heavy iron spades with reinforced blades, a pick designed for breaking rocky soil, a hand auger for drilling post holes, 20 feet of chain, 4 iron brackets, and timber, already cut to specific dimensions, transported at great effort on a pack horse that could have carried trade goods worth actual money. He spent the first week of August selecting a new cabin site. The location he chose was unusual. Most trappers built in valleys near water sources. Nathan built on elevated ground 40 yards from the creek, positioned against a hillside that rose gradually behind the structure. The hillside was critical. What Nathan planned required earth that could be excavated and shaped. Flat ground would not work. He needed a slope he could tunnel into, a natural formation that would support the engineering he had spent 9 months thinking about while watching his partner die. The cabin itself was standard construction, completed in 6 days. He built it alone, which meant compromises in log size and roof complexity. But the cabin was not the innovation. The cabin was simply shelter. What mattered was what came after. On August 15th, Nathan began excavating behind his cabin. He started at the rear wall, 3 feet from the corner. The entrance would be small, 2 feet wide, 2.5 feet tall, just large enough for a man to crawl through on hands and knees. He dug straight back into the hillside, removing soil 1 shovelful at a time, piling it carefully to the side for later use. The first challenge was the entrance frame. Nathan needed a structure that would support the earth above while providing a stable opening that would not collapse inward during freeze and thaw cycles. He used the timber he had transported, cutting 4 vertical posts from logs roughly 8 inches in diameter. He set them deep into the ground, 2 on each side of the entrance, positioned to create a rectangular opening. Across the top, he placed a horizontal header beam, a piece of timber 10 inches thick that spanned the width of the entrance and rested on the prized, vertical posts. He secured everything with iron brackets and wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes. The entrance frame took 3 days to complete. When finished, it resembled a doorway leading into solid earth. Nathan tested it by hanging his full weight from the header beam. The structure held without shifting. He proceeded with the tunnel excavation. The passage extended straight back from the entrance, angling slightly upward to prevent water accumulation. Every 3 feet, Nathan installed timber ribs. These were curved supports made from bent saplings, shaped and positioned to line the tunnel walls and ceiling. The ribs prevented collapse by distributing the weight of earth above across multiple structural points rather than allowing it to concentrate in weak areas. The digging was slow. Rocky soil required the pick. Roots from hillside vegetation had to be cut and removed. Nathan worked alone, spending 8 to 10 hours daily in the confined space, crawling backward as the tunnel extended deeper into the hillside. The tunnel reached 20 feet on September 3, 1842. At this depth, Nathan began excavating the cache chamber, a space that would serve as the terminus of his underground passage and the storage facility that would keep him alive when surface access became impossible. He worked methodically, removing earth to create a room roughly 8 feet square and 7 feet high. The dimensions were deliberate. Large enough to store supplies for an entire winter, small enough that the ceiling could be supported without complex engineering that might fail under the weight of earth and snow above. The walls required reinforcement. Nathan used a technique he had observed in mine shafts during his brief time working Colorado goldfields before turning to trapping. He built log crib walls, stacking horizontal logs in alternating layers perpendicular to each other at the corners. Each layer was slightly smaller than the one below, creating a gradual inward taper that transferred the lateral pressure of earth into vertical compression on the logs themselves. The result was a structure that became stronger as pressure increased rather than weaker. He left gaps between logs on 3 walls for drainage, allowing any moisture seeping through the earth to exit rather than accumulate. The 4th wall, the one facing the tunnel entrance, was solid. Nathan fitted the logs tightly and chinked the gaps with clay mixed with grass. This wall would retain heat during winter, creating a barrier between the stable temperature of the chamber and the colder air of the tunnel leading back to the cabin. The ceiling was constructed from logs spanning the width of the chamber, laid close together and covered with a layer of bark, then a layer of clay, then the excavated earth returned and packed firmly. The multiple layers distributed weight and prevented soil from sifting through gaps between ceiling logs. Ventilation was critical. Nathan understood that enclosed spaces underground could suffocate a man if air could not circulate. He took a hollow log, roughly 6 inches in diameter, and extended it from the chamber ceiling up through the earth to the surface. The log functioned as a chimney for stale air, allowing fresh air to enter through the tunnel while warm, moist air rose and escaped through the ventilation shaft. He positioned the surface opening behind a rock outcropping where snow would not easily block it. Inside the chamber, Nathan built storage infrastructure. He constructed wooden shelves along 3 walls, elevated 2 feet off the earthen floor to prevent moisture contact. The shelves were sturdy, built to hold hundreds of pounds of supplies without sagging. He created divisions within the shelving to separate different supply categories. Dried meat on the left wall, flour, coffee, salt, and sugar on the back wall, ammunition, tools, and medical supplies on the right wall. He installed hooks on the ceiling beams for hanging items that needed to stay completely dry. The floor received attention as well. Nathan laid split logs across the earthen surface, creating a raised wooden floor that would keep supplies and his own body off the damp ground during supply runs. The floor was not sealed. Gaps between the split logs allowed air circulation from below, preventing rot and reducing moisture accumulation. Temperature stability was the chamber's greatest advantage. Buried 4 feet below the surface and insulated by earth on all sides, the space maintained a nearly constant temperature regardless of external conditions. The first snow of 1842 fell on November 20th, 3 weeks earlier than the previous year. Nathan watched from his cabin window as flakes drifted down through still air, accumulating on ground that had already frozen solid. He had spent October stocking his underground cache with methodical precision. 500 pounds of dried elk and venison hung from ceiling hooks. Flour, coffee, salt, and sugar-filled sealed tins on the shelves. Firewood was cut to 2-foot lengths that would fit through the tunnel, stacked along one wall of the chamber. Medical supplies, ammunition, and tools occupied their designated spaces. Everything was organized, labeled, and accessible via the rear tunnel that opened from his cabin's back wall. The snow continued through November and into December with an intensity that surpassed even the previous winter's catastrophic accumulation. By December 10th, drifts had reached 8 feet on the windward side of the cabin. By December 20th, the front door was completely buried. Nathan's window showed nothing but white pressed against the glass. The world above ground had ceased to exist as a navigable space. Other trappers in the region were sealed inside their cabins, beginning the slow arithmetic of rationing supplies that would determine whether they saw spring. Nathan crawled through his tunnel every morning. The passage remained exactly as he had built it, the timber ribs holding firm under the weight of snow that now exceeded 12 feet in depth. The entrance at the cabin's rear wall was a small rectangular opening framed by the vertical posts and horizontal header beam he had installed in August. He would light a candle, place it in a tin holder designed to protect the flame from drafts, and begin the crawl. 22 feet through darkness, his shoulders brushing the tunnel walls, his back touching the timber rib ceiling. 2 minutes of careful movement, pulling an empty canvas sack behind him. The cache chamber was exactly 45 degrees when he entered on the morning of December 25th. The temperature had not varied more than 3 degrees since winter began. Nathan filled his sack with supplies: dried meat for 3 days, coffee, a tin of flour, firewood. He worked by candlelight in a space that remained accessible and functional, while the surface world raged with conditions that had killed men in previous winters. The chamber walls showed no sign of stress. The ventilation shaft drew air properly, preventing the musty smell that plagued poorly ventilated underground spaces. The raised floor kept everything dry. The system worked exactly as he had calculated it would during the long months of planning after Robert's death. He made the return crawl, dragging the heavy sack behind him, emerging into his cabin where the fire burned steady and warm. He unpacked the supplies and arranged them on his shelves. Through the window, visibility was 0. Wind drove snow horizontally across the landscape. The temperature outside was 20 below 0. Nathan added wood to his fire and began preparing coffee. He was warm, fed, and secure. The front door of his cabin had not opened in 3 weeks. It would not open for another 2 months. But he had everything he needed accessible through a passage that existed independent of surface conditions. On January 15, 1843, a brief clearing in the weather allowed Nathan to see across the valley from his window. He could make out the shapes of 2 other cabins, both nearly buried under massive drifts. Spring arrived in late March of 1843, with temperatures that finally rose above freezing for consecutive days. The snow began its slow retreat, melting from the top down, revealing a landscape that had been buried for 4 months. Nathan emerged from his cabin on April 2nd to find the world transformed. The creek ran high with meltwater. Trees that had been reduced to upper branches now stood fully visible. The cache platform he had built the previous year, abandoned after Robert's death, stood empty and weathered 30 feet from his front door. He waited until April 10th before checking on his neighbors. The snow had melted enough that travel was possible, though difficult, through soft ground and remaining drifts. The first cabin he reached belonged to a trapper named James Hickson, a man Nathan had met briefly the previous fall. The cabin door was closed. Nathan knocked and received no answer. He opened the door and found Hickson dead on his sleeping platform, his body preserved by months of freezing temperature. The cabin's interior told the story. Empty shelves, no firewood. A single window that looked out on an outdoor cache platform visible 50 feet away. The cache structure still held supplies. Sacks of flour and dried meat sat untouched, inaccessible through the winter that had buried everything under snow too deep to traverse. The second cabin belonged to a trapper Nathan did not know. The scene was identical. A body preserved by cold. Empty interior shelves. A window facing an outdoor cache that still held full supplies. 2 men dead, with food in sight, but out of reach. Nathan buried them both in graves dug into soil that had finally thawed. He marked the graves with stones and returned to his own cabin, disturbed by the waste of it. Both men had done everything correctly by conventional standards. They had built adequate shelters. They had stored sufficient supplies. They had simply built in a way that assumed surface access would remain possible. George Talbot arrived at Nathan's cabin on April 20th. Talbot was an experienced trapper who worked territory 15 miles north. He had survived the winter, barely, by burning furniture when his outdoor firewood became inaccessible and eating leather straps when his food ran out. He had heard about the 2 dead trappers and wanted to know how Nathan had survived in the same conditions. Nathan showed him the rear tunnel without explanation or preamble. Talbot stared at the small rectangular entrance at the back of the cabin for several seconds before speaking. Nathan led him through the tunnel to the cache chamber. Talbot examined the timber-shored passage, the log crib walls of the chamber, the shelving still partially stocked with supplies. He asked detailed questions about construction time, tools required, and structural principles. Nathan answered everything. He explained the post and beam entrance frame, the timber ribs supporting the tunnel ceiling, the ventilation shaft, the raised floor. He shared the techniques freely because the innovation had not been born from a desire for profit or recognition. It had been born from watching a man die because conventional building methods created death traps in extreme conditions. If others could benefit, that was enough. The summer of 1843 saw a transformation across the northern Rocky Mountain trapping territories. George Talbot returned to his cabin in May and immediately began excavating a rear tunnel using the techniques Nathan had shared. By July, 3 other trappers who had heard Talbot's account were digging similar passages behind their own cabins. The innovation spread through conversation and demonstration rather than formal instruction. Trappers visited Nathan's cabin to see the system firsthand, asked questions about structural principles and construction methods, then returned to their own territories to build variations adapted to their specific terrain and available materials. Not every trapper adopted the technique. Some considered the labor excessive for a problem that might never recur. Others lacked the hillside terrain necessary for proper cache chamber construction. A few simply refused to believe that the previous winter's snow depth would repeat, assuming 1842 had been an anomaly rather than a possibility that could strike again. But those who had lost partners or who had survived only through luck understood what Nathan had demonstrated. Surface access could fail. Underground access, properly engineered, could not. By 1845, backdoor tunnels had become common enough that the term itself had entered regional vocabulary. Trappers referred to cabins as having or lacking a back door, the word carrying meaning beyond its literal definition. A cabin with a back door meant a structure built by someone who understood that survival required redundancy, who had invested time in infrastructure that eliminated dependence on surface conditions. The phrase "built with a back door" became shorthand for serious construction, for thinking beyond immediate convenience toward long-term survival. The winter of 1846 brought validation again. Snow accumulated to depths approaching the 1842 catastrophe. Trappers with rear tunnels weathered the season without incident. Those without faced the same deadly mathematics of inaccessible supplies and dwindling indoor stocks. 3 men died that winter in conventional cabins. 0 died in cabins equipped with tunnel access to underground caches. The pattern was clear enough that even the skeptics began excavating the following summer. Nathan Coleridge left the mountains in 1848. He had accumulated enough money from 8 years of trapping to purchase land in western Oregon. He married in 1850, established a small farm, and raised 2 children who never knew the details of their father's time in the wilderness. He died in 1873, at age 56, buried in a cemetery outside Eugene. His gravestone recorded his name, birth year, death year, and nothing else. In the mountains he had left behind, cabins built with rear tunnels continued serving new occupants. Homesteaders moving west in the 1850s and 60s discovered abandoned trapper cabins with mysterious rectangular openings in their rear walls, passages leading into hillsides to underground chambers that remained dry and stable decades after construction. Some of these structures were reoccupied and maintained. Others gradually collapsed as timber rotted and earth reclaimed the spaces that had been carved from it. But the principle persisted. The understanding that survival sometimes required building downward rather than outward, that access beneath the surface could provide security when access across the surface failed, that engineering applied carefully could eliminate problems before they became crises. Nathan's innovation, born from tragedy and refined through necessity, had solved a fundamental problem of frontier existence. Not through strength or weapons or bravery, but through understanding that conventional methods were not the only methods, and that sometimes the best door was the one nobody expected.